Hello everyone, this is Lachlan for Minidisc TV, and in the store today we have the new open back flagship headphone from Fostex, the TH909. And this is quite a special headphone, it's quite unique, so I thought it would be nice to do an in-depth review of this headphone. We're going to be comparing it today against the Fostex TH610 and the Fostex TH900. These are both closed back headphones though, so I thought it would also be useful to compare the 909 against some of the open back competition in this price range, like the Sennheiser HD800S, the Focal Clear, and the Audio Technica ADX5000. So we've got a lot to get through in this review, and we even have a written blog post, which I've linked in the description of this video, which is even more detailed if you want to check that out. But yeah, there's quite a lot to talk about with the 909, so let's get into it. So the 909 now sits on top of Fostex's range as the most expensive TH series headphone, but it's quite similar to the TH900 in a lot of ways. It uses the same kind of beautiful hand-lacquered urushi wood-finished ear cups, as well as the same biocellulose drivers. Of course, the most notable difference is this open backed grill that you can see here, and strap yourselves in now for some hot and heavy grill talk, because there's actually quite a lot of interesting things going on with this grill. If you look carefully, you can actually tell that this metal grill is actually two metal grills sandwiched on top of each other, and Fostex calls this a dual layered structure. And what it means is that you get holes across the entire grill that are of a non-uniform shape and size. Now, as far as I can tell, reading Fostex's information, they've done this because every single one of these grills will produce a slight resonance or noise as air passes through it. And by making all the holes different shapes, Fostex is trying to distribute this noise across different frequencies rather than having it concentrate at one frequency. I really do not know if it makes a huge difference, but it does make for a really interesting look to this headphone. You're gonna love it or hate it. For me, it grew on me over time. One thing that you will notice when you really look at the 909 is that you'll realize it's actually pretty closed for an open headphone. So a lot of the back of the headphone is obscured by these wood rings, and the metal grill actually closes off a lot more of the headphone, and even where it has ports and openings in the grill, there's an additional layer of fabric or foam that's blocking off the ports. So I would describe the 909 as a semi-open rather than an open headphone like the Audio Technica ADX5000, where the driver is completely open the environment. So because the 909 is semi-open, it isolates you a little better from external noise than your average open headphone, and it leaks noise a little less than your average open headphone. And this is sort of funny comparing it to the closed back TH900, because the 900 and the 610 never isolated particularly well for closed headphones. And the 909 only has a little bit worse isolation than the closed back 900 series headphones. The 909 is pretty much as comfortable as the 900 because it's approximately the same weight and it uses very similar ear pads. It's actually a little more comfortable because being semi-open, it's a little more breathable than the 900. It's still not as lightweight and comfortable as something like the Audio-Technica ADX5000 or the Sennheiser HD800S, but it's more comfortable than, say, the Focal Clear, because the ear pads are a bit plusher and clamping force isn't quite as high. So we're going to move on to sound, but before we do, I should note that the 909 is not a particularly hard to drive headphone, and in our testing we were able to reliably drive it from a variety of portable sources, including the Sony ZX300A with a matching Sony PHA-2A amplifier, or things like the Chord Hugo 2. Now, we were also even able to power it directly from the single-ended output of the ZX300 without going far past 50% volume, so it's not a particularly hard to drive headphone. So I'm going to start off these sound comparisons by giving you some context with my opinions on the Fostex TH610 and the TH900. Now, the 610 is basically my favorite closed headphone. It's not just my favorite closed headphone under $1,000, it's basically my favorite closed headphone, because Fostex has done a brilliant job of combining a really thick, rich, beautiful bass response with a beautiful way of bringing out female vocals in the upper mid-range. And it's not necessarily the most flat or neutral sounding headphone, but I just really love this headphone for the kind of magical sound it has. Now, strangely enough, I'm not a big fan of the TH900, even though it's the flagship in the sort of close back series. And that's because it takes a lot of what the TH610 does and it exaggerates it a little bit much for me. So the bass, whereas it's rich on the 610, it can get a little overwhelming on the 900. And in terms of the upper mid-range and particularly the treble, it can tend to sound quite raw and aggressive and sibilant, especially with modern kind of pop recordings. So with some tracks, the 900 sounds really magical, but with a lot of other tracks that I listen to, it can get a bit much. Now, if you take the 610 pads and you put them on the 900, you actually get quite an agreeable sound, but in stock form, the 900 is not really my cup of tea. So by making the 909 a semi-open headphone, Fostex has done a number of things with the sound. Number one, starting from the bass response, the low frequencies, the 909 doesn't have quite as much bass as 610 and definitely not as much bass as the 900, but it still preserves much of that kind of warm, rich depth to the low notes. It's just not as overwhelming, and I would argue that it's actually somewhat more natural than the 610 and the 900. Of course, the 610 and even the 900 are really fun with their kind of deep bass response. So if you're a bit of a bass head, you might get more out of the closed back Fostexes. But I think with the 909, it actually sounds more natural in the low end. Bass is flatter, but it still has that kind of warmth and depth to it, which is really nice. Now, with the higher end of the sound, the treble, the 909 approaches the 900 in terms of the aggressiveness of the sibilant region. It's not quite as bad as the 900. It doesn't pick up quite as much of the S notes and the kind of splashiness in that range, but it still does pop up with modern kind of pop or hip hop tracks every now and then. So the 909, that's probably going to be your biggest pain point with this headphone, is the tendency to emphasize that S sibilance range. Now at the frequencies above 6 to 8 kilohertz where that kind of S note sibilance is, the 909 is actually not that open sounding compared to, say, the Audio Technica ADX 5000 or the Focal Clear or even the Sennheiser HD800S. So it tends to sound a little blunted in the very highest frequencies. Maybe it's because it's a semi-open headphone. It doesn't have that sense of space and air in the same way that those other headphones do. But because of that kind of slightly rolled off high range and also the more subdued bass response, the 909 does something really, really special with the upper mid-range, particularly where female vocals are. That region is now more prominent and it has a beautiful, beautiful texture to it. And that is by far what you'll hear time and time again showcased on the 909 with female vocals. It has a really wonderful sense of layering and depth to female vocals and brass instruments like saxophones and that sort of thing. It's really something that's worth listening to. And I've written kind of comprehensive listening notes with the 909 with a variety of tracks where I think it does really well. And you can check that out in the description of this video. There's a link to that blog post. Now I'm going to drill down into more detail with the comparison, starting with the Focal Clear. Now, the Focal Clear is more of a neutral headphone than the 909. It's still a little warmer than what I would consider technically completely neutral, but it's flatter than the 909. So in terms of bass, it's got almost as much bass as the 909, and perhaps the bass is even a little cleaner and faster, but it doesn't have the same kind of dense impact that the 909 does in the sub-bass regions. In terms of the upper mid-range, it's a lot more mellow and calmer on the Clear, and in terms of high frequency extension, it's actually got a bit more of that sense of open space than the 909. So for me, the 909, if you find this a bit bright, a bit aggressive, the clear is the safer kind of choice. It may not sound as magical as the 909 does on some tracks, but at the same time, it's more of a comfortable listen on a lot of other tracks. Now, on the other side of the coin is the Audio-Technica ADX5000, which I tend to think of as Audio-Technica's take on the Sennheiser HD800. So it's got a similar sort of bright sound, but it's still got a little bit of that flavor in the upper mid-range that Audio-Technica is famous for. So overall, I think the ADX5000 is brighter than the 909, but it's bright in a different way. So even though Audio-Technica is famous for its upper mid-range, it's not quite as forward in that region as the 909. And conversely, in the upper high frequency treble, the ADX5000 sounds more open. So I think this is sort of my pick for particularly classical kind of pieces, because string instruments tend to have a bit more air and energy with the ADX5000. Definitely in terms of bass response, the ADX5000 is nowhere near as punchy and dense as the 909. So comparing the 909 against the Sennheiser HD800S, it's a bit more of a night and day difference than compared with the Focal Clear or the ADX5000, where I think that both of those headphones sort of sit along either side of the 909 in terms of that scale from warmth to brightness. With the HD800S, you get a completely different sound in terms of a much wider, much more diffuse sound stage. And you also get a sound that is much less aggressive in any frequency. So with the HD800S, I don't feel that it particularly emphasizes any frequency whatsoever. And this is sort of my reference point for technical accuracy, though I don't think it's necessarily the most fun sounding headphone. Personally, for me, I prefer that the 909 has a bit more flavor and color, and even the Focal Clear, but without a doubt, this is sort of your reference point for both soundstage width and technical accuracy. So in conclusion, where do I come down on with the 909? So I think the 909 is a really beautiful headphone, and when it works its magic with particular tracks, particularly female vocalists, anything that's sort of mastered with a kind of slow mellowness to it, the 909 really does sound natural, beautiful, textured, wonderful. On some other tracks, not necessarily all modern pop recordings, but just some of them, it can sound a bit raw and aggressive, and it's enough aggression for me to say that the 909 isn't a perfect all-rounder. I would be really proud to own the 909 in a collection of headphones, but that's the bottom line. I think the 909 is not enough of an all-rounder that it could replace a collection of headphones and be your be-all and end-all unless you really listen to a somewhat narrow variety of music. But I think the 909 easily competes with other open headphones in the $2,000 price range. So if you like your female vocalists, you really, really owe it to yourself to have a listen to the 909. So let us know what you think in the comments of this video, and also check out the blog post that I've linked that goes into even more detail about how the 909 stacks up, particularly with a wider variety of tracks that I've tried it with. This is Lachlan for Minidisc TV. See you next time.